So in my last lecture, I went over the Industrial Revolution, what it was, some of the factors that made this possible, as well as some of the broad changes that occurred to society, right? I talked about the population growth, the economic growth. I talked about the shift from a agricultural society to a urban industrial society. But today I really want to dive into how this changes things for ordinary Americans. Because as industrialization becomes the norm in American society, work habits, the physical environment that work is occurring in, the pace of labor, they all start to change pretty remarkably in response to the industrialization that is occurring. In other words, we had to completely reimagine American notions of work in response to this. And in order to illustrate what I'm talking about, I want to talk about one industry in particular, shoemaking. But these changes that I'm talking about in regards to shoemaking are really applicable to most industries in the United States during this time. Now, if you were a shoemaker before 1850, you were what was known as a skilled artisan. This meant you possessed knowledge that made you a marketable person. You could build a pair of shoes from start to finish using the raw materials necessary to build that pair of shoes. And because you could do this, the people in your community valued your labor, and if they needed a pair of shoes, you were the person to come to. This gave you a certain degree of status in society. But also because you're producing shoes largely for people that you know, there was less pressure put on you in terms of the pace of your labor, right? You would make decisions about how hard you worked based on the amount of work that needed to be done. The number of people that were counting on you to produce shoes for them, well, that was how hard you worked. So if there was a holiday, typically those holidays were recognized because your whole community was celebrating them. You could take time off at will. If you wanted to just stop work in the middle of the day and go do something else, you probably could because you owned your own shop. In fact, you lived in the shop that you owned probably. You worked with your family and other close friends. The boundaries between your personal life and your work life are really blurred. There wasn't a set time that you stopped work. You might work late into the night, but you might have taken 4 hours off in the middle of the day to go do something else. It didn't really matter because really what it boiled down to was, do you get the shoes made that you need to? Do the people that are counting on you to make a pair of shoes for them receive the product that they asked you for? And if they did, it didn't matter whether you did that at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. You got to make those decisions. You were in charge of your own hours, and you got to take time off when you needed to. And if you got sick and couldn't work, you're working again with your close friends and family. Everyone else is going to just chip in to cover. But this really starts to change as manufacturing becomes the norm, and because work becomes increasingly mechanized, meaning it's reliant on machines, and the manufacturing process, in order to become more efficient, really breaks down the process of producing these shoes into a series of repetitive, easily mastered steps. And what this means is that the skill level needed to make a pair of shoes decreases. And workers become answerable to a manager. And that manager, their job is to manage the people that are under them, to make sure that they continue to produce a set amount of goods in a set amount of time. This means that if you're a shoemaker, after industrial manufacturing becomes the norm, you don't have flexibility in terms of scheduling time off, the pace of your work. You're expected to show up at a set time every day, and you're expected to work a set number of hours. You're expected to produce a certain number of shoes, regardless of the number of people in your community that are asking for those shoes. The manager's job is to make sure you produce as much as possible. So all of these things become less flexible as factories become the norm. And this has a major effect on our relationship with work in this country. Really, three things start to happen that overthrow the old systems of labor that had really predominated in the early 1800s. The first is it undermines the expertise of skilled artisans, right? If you had that ability to build a pair of shoes from start to finish, this gave you certain status in society. But now this status is no longer valued because that knowledge no longer benefits you if you're working in the shoemaking industry, because all you need to do is you need to make one small portion of that shoe and then pass it off to the next person. The skill that's required to do this is much lower, which means you're easily replaceable. So your expertise that you have as a shoemaker no longer is valued. And this means you don't have power, for instance, to negotiate your salary. And this is really good from a factory standpoint, because this means that workers in shoe factories can really produce a lot of goods. This increases the factory's output, but it also means that workers in shoe factories are not being taught skills that provide them any long-term benefit as laborers, if that makes sense. And this is because work has become increasingly repetitive. Workers are expected to complete one task, and that task only, and to repeat that task over and over and over again throughout the day. And this really changes the average laborer's relationship to the economy. If you were a shoemaker in the early 1800s and there was an economic downturn and fewer people in your community could afford shoes, you would sell fewer shoes. You might have to cut back in order to continue to support your family. But you remained a shoemaker, and you still held on to those skills that you had as a shoemaker. And when things started to recover economically, you could then use those skills to continue making a living, right? But industrialization results in what are known as cyclical labor patterns, which means that because those skills are no longer as valued, if there's an economic downturn, those factories are going to start laying off workers. Because as an average worker, you don't really produce much value to them because you're easily replaceable. You only have to do the same thing over and over and over again. So they're not as inclined to hold on to you as an employee if there's less demand for the shoes that you're producing. And so the average industrial worker might make shoes one year, but once they get laid off, they might go work in a steel factory instead. And this meant, for the most part, that workers in any given industry were less experienced than the workers were 50 years previously, right? If you were a shoemaker in 1800, you tended to stay a shoemaker. You worked as a shoemaker the rest of your life. Suddenly, this is no longer the case. You might go work in several different industries. And there are some really far-reaching economic effects of this. This intensifies the natural boom and bust cycles. This means periods of high economic activity and periods of low economic activity. This is a natural part of the economic cycle, but this becomes much more intense following industrialization, right? Because factories, in pursuit of their short-term economic goals, right, maximizing their profits, when demand for their product goes down, they try to save on costs by firing workers. Those workers can no longer afford the goods produced by that factory, and therefore this downward economic cycle becomes more intense, right? That the economic harm of these labor patterns in particular, cyclical labor patterns intensified the effects of the natural boom and bust cycles that caused economic downturns. This means, right, that industrialization leads to this massive economic growth in the second half of the 19th century, but it also created conditions that ensured that economic depressions would be more dramatic, they'd last longer, and would be more resistant to recovery. What this basically means is, right, is that factories in pursuit of their short-term economic goals are going to take actions that are going to be more harmful to the economy in the long term. In other words, there's fewer people that need to buy shoes. We're going to lay off a third of our workforce so that we are more profitable in the short term. But then all of those workers that get laid off, they can no longer afford to purchase the goods produced in American factories, which further decreases demand and can lead to more layoffs, right? And it becomes this kind of self-perpetuating thing that leads to downward economic spirals. And this is a fundamental change to the American economy. And this would really kind of culminate in the late 1920s with the Great Depression, and we'll talk about that when we get to that unit. But to really summarize this, industrialization changed how we work as a country in three ways. It undermined the expertise of skilled artisans, it made work more repetitive, and it resulted in cyclical labor patterns and the frequent shifting of laborers between industries. Which brings me to my next point. What was it like to be a worker in the early days of industrialized America? First thing to note about labor in this period is that the days were long. The average worker during this time worked about 72 hours a week, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And this was nearly double of what we think about today as a full-time job. And the second thing to keep in mind is that accidents and injuries were incredibly common in early industrial factories. The reasons for this are complicated, but basically, I talked a little bit about kind of the laissez-faire attitude most Americans had about the government's role in the economy during my lecture on Reconstruction. Well, this was still very much the case during this time, and as a result, there were very few regulations, government regulations protecting workers, and because of this, factory owners subjected labor to almost constant pressure to speed up production, and this combines with the fact that we had an already overworked labor force, again 72 hours a week, performing repetitive and mind-numbing tasks. And this labor force is lacking experience in their current jobs due to those cyclical labor patterns, getting laid off in economic downturns, meaning you haven't worked in the industry that you're working in currently for as long on average. And you largely are unskilled because of the specialization of labor. And the effects of this are catastrophic. Between 1888 and 1889 alone, 20,000 people are permanently disabled, meaning seriously injured on the job, and another 2,000 die in work-related accidents. Now, this may seem like a relatively small number, but the thing to keep in mind is this is about 3% of the total workforce in the country during this time. 3%, meaning over a period of about 30 years, if this continued and the workforce stayed static, 100% of the American workforce would either die or be permanently disabled as a result of the conditions in early factories. This is completely unsustainable. But I did mention this massive population growth that's going on in the country, right? That the population quadruples during this time period as well, and this is what makes the levels of injuries and things like this sustainable, and this is what makes factories be able to continue to not do anything about the factories. But these conditions, these long hours, dangerous conditions, incredible amount of pressure to produce as much of a good as possible in a short amount of time. This is what leads to the birth of the American labor movement, and that's what I will talk about later on in the credit.